Bishop Robert Barron is one of my favourite peeps on YouTube. He has presented a great defence of public Catholicism online, and that's sorely needed. His sharp philosophical mind, his erudite theology, his sound theology has done wonders for Catholics and for the wider Christian community. But recently I've seen him in talks, as we saw in our last video, with more right-wing characters like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro and others. And so really what I'd like to do is have a little bit of a closer look at him. So I've picked a video where he is addressing the Acton Institute or the Acton University. So as we always do, we're going to watch and talk our way through this video. Let's see where it goes.
Just marvelous, and a much needed conversation between the classical religious tradition and the economic and political traditions, a conversation that often, as you know, doesn't happen creatively. So thank you for the invitation. Father has invited me before, but it was more difficult when I was in California. Now in Minnesota, it's a little easier flight over here to Grand Rapids. Listen, I want to talk to you tonight about wokeism, not because I like it, but because I hate it. And I think...
Okay, so this is us right into the meat of the conversation. He is going to be talking about wokeism. Not woke, but wokeism. Note here that he has changed this into an ism. This is an ideology as far as he sees it. And strange words for a Christian, that this is something he hates. Strong words. Okay, as far as I understand woke, this is an idea that came out of African American protest. An idea of staying awake to prejudice and injustice, and that over time this has been extended to various marginal groups. From my understanding of the gospel, where Jesus is situated on the side of the poor and the church's historical preferential option for the poor, this positioning of Barron as a hater of wokeism is immediately interesting. So this has definitely piqued my interest.
I think it's having a massively deleterious effect on our culture. It's found its way into almost every nook and cranny of our civilization now. One of our major political parties is largely organized now, it seems to me, to support wokeism. But I think...
Oh, so let's keep politics out of the pulpit. Again, we get to see exactly the same memory, or exactly the same position I was sold when I was in seminary, and the memory of my time in seminary, where we were instructed to keep politics out of the pulpit. Experience has taught me that politics is always in the pulpit, and what our educators meant by keep politics out of the pulpit was keep non-status quo politics out of the pulpit. So the pulpit isn't a place for anything that challenges the prevailing power structures. He is basically canvassing here for the grand old party. This is an attack on the Democrats, and that would have been very clear to his audience. His audience are obviously lapping this up. They're all giving him a round of applause. So he is very much singing to his own crowd here. This is a little disappointing.
I think it's very important, everybody, if we stand against it as I do, that we do so in a sophisticated way, and to recognize that wokeism is not a ephemeral phenomenon that came out of the summer of 2020. Wokeism has a long and easily recognizable, it seems to me, intellectual pedigree.
His issue is what emerged from 2020. interestingly, he doesn't have an issue at all with what came out of 2021, namely January the 6th. But then he is talking to the Acton Institute, and perhaps we should frame this properly before we go any further. The Acton Institute, connecting good intentions with sound economics. Acton University is not your typical conference. It's a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Right, so this is a right-wing neoliberal think tank, and he has been invited to give the good intentions or to remind the capitalists that, you know, they may have to at least pay lip service to some sense of common morality. Okay, that's his thing.
And the more clearly we grasp that, the more creatively we'll be able to engage it. I'm going to begin not so much with a definition, but a description. Wokeism, I would say, is a popularization of critical theory. It's a popularization of critical theory.
Please tell me I wasn't the only person to get the dog whistle there. The dog whistle being critical theory, because right now the fash or the fascists are all up in our grills about critical race theory. And this is very much part of what critical theory is. Bishop Barron has a problem with this, and no doubt he's going to dig a little deeper.
Theory having made its way now out into the streets. What's critical theory? Well, it's a movement that obtained largely in the French and German academies in the middle of the 20th century. Think of people such as Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, maybe the major names. But critical theory found its way in the late 60s and 70s into the American Academy. I just finished a biography of René Girard, and Girard himself...
Girard was a friend of Derrida.
Though I think would be an opponent of wokeism, but he was involved in organizing a conference at Johns Hopkins in the late 60s, where Derrida came over for the first time to these shores. And he said it was the moment when French structuralism and postmodernism made its way into the American Academy. Well, there it gestated, it seems to me, for several decades, and then broke out as a kind of bacillus into the wider bloodstream of the society.
It broke out like a basilisk, a great serpent, a beast. Now, note the time scale here. This is through the civil rights period. Of course, there'd be a reason why critical theory was growing like a great demon from the chthonic underworld, challenging all these very privileged white people at places like Acton University.
Indeed, in that summer of 2020. So what I'm going to try to do tonight, in just very brief compass, is lay out some of the features of critical theory, which has now expressed itself as wokeism, and then just to suggest how Catholic social theory...
So, critical theory, of which critical race theory is a part, has expressed itself as wokeism, which Bishop Barron hates. Now let's bear that in mind for the rest of what he's got to say.
He stands dramatically athwart the assumptions behind wokeism. Okay, so here's the first quality, I think, of critical theory. What I will call a radicalization of the modern sense of the self. A radicalization of the modern sense of the self. Now, as you know, the two probably major figures in the emergence of typically modern philosophy would be René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. I've told my students over the years, if you want to see the place where modernity was born, you can find it. It's in the German city of Ulm. Because Descartes was wandering around with the French army, and he slipped off. He was searching for the foundations of philosophy, and he said he retreated to a heated room in.
What I guess, or where I guess he's going here, is that the great dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and the critique of pure reason from Kant as the bedrock of modern philosophy are somehow enemies of a prior, more authoritarian philosophy of revelation. That's where I'd put my tenor right now.
In the city of Ulm. And there he came up with the famous cogito ergo sum, right? I can doubt everything. I can doubt the received tradition. I can doubt religion. I can doubt even.
Yeah, exactly as I thought.
And sense experience, but the one thing I can't possibly doubt is that I'm doubting. Hence, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, notice the move, though, that Descartes makes here, is he compels the objective to come before the bar of the subjective for adjudication.
So, what is objective, which clearly Descartes acknowledged he couldn't know, he brings before the bar of the subjective, which clearly he can know. Okay, I really don't have a problem with that. In fact, that is the basis of all modern rational thinking. We can't know the objective unless, or we can't know what is objective truth without the subjectivity of our own mind with which to, begin to understand this. That's not, we can't understand ultimate truth without our own minds. Our own minds are the first encounter, subjectively to ultimate truth. Yeah, of course.
Because now the cogito reigns supreme as the arbiter of truth.
No, it's not the arbiter of truth. It's the encounter with truth, which is subjective. But yet, I guess you know that, and I guess you're assuming your audience don't know that, and this is the very essence of sophistry. Yeah, of course.
Also on this basis, he distinguishes between what he calls res extense, extended things out there, and then res cogitantes, thinking things in here. The radical division between body and soul is bequeathed to modernity as a typical anthropology. Now, the second figure, Immanuel Kant.
Before we got on to Kant here, this radical division between body and soul thing is, I think, fairly fundamental to the project of reason, that what is interior is all that we can know of ourselves, and it's the interior reflexivity that can grasp the exteriority, and there shouldn't be a problem with that in modern thinking.
You see it famously in his critique of pure reason when the classical metaphysical categories of time and space and identity and substance are not out there in the world. They're already in here as a priori structures of the mind, right? So we project these realities onto the world. Same thing in Kant's moral theory. Remember, he says the only thing that can be called good without qualification is a good will. That means I'm not looking to my acts in the world to determine what's right or wrong. I'm looking at the quality of the will that chooses.
Which incidentally is good Catholic theology as well. If we equate Kant's goodwill with Catholic thinking's informed conscience, the informed conscience is in a sense infallible, because the informed conscience cannot err. And the good will as such, the informed will as Kant would have it, much like Catholic thinking's conscience, is much the same. So he's picking a fight with Kant here that's really putting him in sticky position, in a sticky position, in the face of his own theology.
The move, again, privileging the interior over the exterior.
The interior is privileged over the exterior, so long as it is good, and by that we mean the informed conscience. Even Joseph Ratzinger was very firm on this. Right, okay, so he's positioned these as bad things. This is the beginning of the separation of human reason as autonomous thinking, forcing waging a war of independence from divine revelation. Apparently that's bad.
I think you could argue, read Cyril O'Regan on this point, that Descartes and Kant do represent a recovery of ancient Gnosticism, which in a very similar way...
So now it's a kind of a heresy. This is nuts.
Privilege the sort of inside over the outside. Tended to see the body as something dangerous and problematic, and the real self inside. Now, critical theory.
This isn't what Descartes or Kant ever said. They're not Gnostics. That this was not about mind over matter. It was the idea of the superiority of reason over myth. It's not Gnosticism at all.
Theory, I would argue, radicalizes this modern sense of the self. So that the interior, the real me in here, is dramatically privileged over what's out there, over the exteriority of the body. If you don't see this influence in present-day gender theory, you're not paying attention.
Okay. It certainly didn't take him long to get to gender theory. More dog whistles. He's singing to a right-wing audience. His problem is what has happened in the summer of 2020, ignoring the winter of 2021. This is capitalism in crisis. This is his theology being put to the service of a fascist way of thinking. Gender theory, of all the things in the world a bishop of the church can be picking on right now. He comes from the United States of America, where his own society is now experiencing more mass shootings than it ever has in its history. We look at the poor in America, people who are now being forced to choose between ongoing cancer care and death by a society that is so unequal and so unjust. And here is the good bishop wearing lovely silver jewellery, very expensive clothes, in an economics forum, speaking to some of the most privileged, powerful and influential people in the United States. And of all things, his issue is with gender theory. Yeah, just as Jesus would have done.
I mean, what do we hear all the time? And it's extraordinary to me how taken for granted it is, though it's a terribly erroneous anthropology, but it's taken for granted. Well,
it's an erroneous anthropology, says a man, with all credit to him, an accomplished philosopher, a good theologian, who is not an anthropologist. It's somehow erroneous to say that gender theory is something. Now, let's bear in mind that There is no such thing as gender theory. The term gender theory is the discussion on gender. It's a massive corpus with lots of voices and lots of opinions, not all of which agree with one another. It's sort of like philosophy. It's not a monolith. It's not something with a creedal statement. And to begin to suggest that somehow this is a modern invention flies in the face of what's known even in his own Bible, in, I think, Deuteronomy chapter 22. I'm going to take a stab, tell me if I'm wrong, verse 5, where it is said it is an abomination for a woman to dress like a man and for a man to dress like a woman. And that even became an issue to the biblical authors, meant that way back when, in Torah times, transgenderism, or transgender identity was a thing. So this isn't new, Bishop.
I mean, deep down inside, this is who I am. It just doesn't correspond to my body, so I have to change my body accordingly. That's a radicalized modern self, the privileging of the interior over the exterior.
And yet it's understood in the Bible. So this isn't modern.
Just by way of contrast, consider this little line from St. Thomas Aquinas, my intellectual hero. Aquinas says,
before we get into Thomas Aquinas, I'd like to, reflect on Aquinas myself. That the great doctor of the church said that nothing is intrinsically bad in its nature. That's important here. That gay people, trans people, and straight people are so by their nature. And if we are to take Thomas Aquinas seriously, God doesn't make mistakes. He didn't make a mistake in making gay, queer, and trans people. He didn't make a mistake in making straight people. God's not into the business of mistakes. And that is what is picked up by Aquinas when he says, nothing in its nature is bad. But let's hear what Aquinas has said.
the soul is in the body, yes, but not as contained by it, but rather as containing it. Let me say that again, because I think there's a whole revolution in consciousness there. The soul is in the body, yes, but not as contained by it, like it's deep down in here, hidden someplace, but rather as containing it. The body, Thomas calls it the form of the body, the soul rather, the form of the body.
As interesting and as academic as this philosophical discussion is, I'm not entirely sure his audience of free marketeers and neoliberals are lapping this up the way he'd like them to. I think we should take a break here. Perhaps we'll get to cover the rest of this talk at a later time. In fact, that's something I would like to do. If it's something you'd like to see, by all means let me know in the comments and we can do the second half at a later date. But at least we've finished the first part of this discussion where Bishop Barron has discussed his take on critical theory. It's not that impressive, but then again, he is talking to a particular audience, and personally I'm a little disappointed by his take, considering all the other things that are happening in American society and around the world right now. It's disappointing. But thanks for watching.